The chain on my Westgate hit the dirt at 5:38 on a cold Saturday morning, and I heard it from the kitchen with my coffee halfway to my lips. By the time I reached the porch, 12 strangers were driving utility carts across my pasture like they had booked a place for a corporate retreat. At the center of them stood a woman named Celeste Harrow, wearing a cream riding jacket, polished boots, and the calm smile of someone who had already decided my land belonged to her. I set my cup on the porch rail, pulled on my old canvas coat, and walked down the gravel lane while the eastern sky was still the color of fireplace ash. Celeste watched me approach without the slightest embarrassment. Behind her, men in matching black shirts were unloading tents, folding tables, survey equipment, coolers, and two bright orange canoes beside the creek my grandfather had protected for nearly a century. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," she said, like we were meeting at a charity breakfast. "The Ridgeview Preserve Association is beginning a 60-day documentation period for our community access claim." I looked past her at the tire marks cutting through the blue flax my mother had planted before she died. Then, at the broken chain lying in the grass. "You cut my gate." She gave a little shrug. "Your gate was obstructing a historic access route." Now, I had spent 30 years listening to people lie in courtrooms, and one thing I learned early was that confident people often mistake silence for surrender. Celeste mistook mine immediately. She started explaining adverse use, community rights, recreational necessity, and something she called inherited access expectations, which sounded like a legal phrase invented during a wine tasting. I let her finish, then I asked who advised her. She named a lawyer from Billings, named Preston Vale, a man I remembered from a land fraud case 12 years earlier. He had testified with great confidence and very little relationship to the truth. I nodded once. "Mrs. 1. Harrow, you and everyone with you have 45 minutes to collect your equipment, repair nothing, touch nothing else, and leave through the gate you destroyed." Her smile tightened, but it stayed on her face. "We filed a notice with the county recorder on Tuesday. Until the matter is decided, we have standing." "No," I said, "you have stationary. Standing comes from a court. What you have right now is criminal trespass." 45 minutes. She laughed softly, the way wealthy people sometimes laugh when they believe consequences are a service available only to other people. "Mr. Humbert Stones, Mercer, I understand your father is sentimental about this property, but sentiment is not law." That sentence did more damage to her than she understood. My father, Everett Mercer, was 83 years old and had slept in the same upstairs bedroom of our ranch house every night he had spent in Wyoming since 1943. He still walked the lower pasture at sunrise, still carried peppermint candy for nervous calves, and still believed a man should sharpen his own tools because dull blades encourage bad habits. The ranch had been bought by his grandfather, Samuel Mercer, in 1927 with money saved from railroad work and a small military pension. 2,100 acres of sage, cottonwood, limestone, and Coal Creek water outside the town of Red Bluff, almost dead center between nowhere and the next nowhere. Ridgeview Preserve had appeared along our western boundary 6 years earlier, 58 luxury homes built on 10-acre lots and marketed to people who wanted the romance of ranch life without the smell, weather, debt, or actual ranching. The homes averaged $3.5 million. The yearly association dues were $22,000. Celeste and her husband, Nolan Harrow, had developed the community through a company registered in Delaware and had spent the previous 2 years trying to buy 280 acres of our creek frontage. My father had refused them 5 times. Apparently, 5 refusals had offended their sense of natural law. I turned and walked back to the house. Dad was standing inside the kitchen door in pajama pants, wool socks, and the expression he wore whenever machinery made a sound it should not make. "How many?" he asked. 12, maybe 13. "You want the rifle?" "No. I want Sheriff Tom Bell. Drive into town and bring him here in person. Do not call from the house. Do not argue with anybody at the gate. And Dad, please put on real pants." He looked down at his plaid pajama bottoms. "These are real pants. They have pockets." Then he disappeared upstairs and was in his truck 9 minutes later wearing Wranglers, boots, and the same hat he had owned since the first Reagan administration. I called my attorney, Claire Duval, in Red Bluff. She had handled my wife's estate after cancer took Lydia 7 years earlier, and she had handled my mother's estate 2 years after that. Claire answered, sounding awake. which was either professional discipline or a serious character defect. I gave her the facts. She asked 3 questions, told me to record everything, and warned me not to leave the property. Then she paused. "Miles, are you still keeping your state appointment quiet?" "For one more weekend," I said. I'd been sworn in 10 days earlier as Wyoming's new Secretary of State after the former officeholder resigned over a campaign finance scandal. The governor had called me because I had spent 24 years as a district judge, and because, according to him, I had the unusual ability to make boring things sound important. My formal introduction to the public was scheduled for Monday morning in Cheyenne. I had not told anyone in Red Bluff except my father, Claire, and my daughter Hannah, who was finishing veterinary school in Colorado and had promised not to post anything online. Claire went quiet. Then she said, "Take good video, Judge. I have a feeling Monday just got interesting." I went back outside with my phone recording. Celeste's crew had ignored my deadline. They were driving stakes into the creek bank, setting up canvas tents, and hanging a wooden sign that read, "Ridgeview Community Heritage Access Site." Heritage, apparently, had arrived that morning in a trailer behind a black SUV. I filmed the broken gate, the cut chain, the tire tracks, the men's company logos, the survey markers, and every face I could capture without interfering. I narrated the time and location in a voice so calm it surprised even me. Celeste sat in a folding chair drinking coffee from a silver thermos. She raised the cup toward me. "Building your little case. Preserving yours," I said. Sheriff Tom Bell arrived at 7002 with my father behind him in the truck. Tom walked the gate, examined the chain, looked at the tents, then removed his sunglasses and approached Celeste. "Ma'am, you and your group need to leave this property now. We have a filed claim," she said. "You have a civil notice. The Mercer deed has been recorded since 1927. Until a judge says otherwise, you are trespassing and you damaged a locked gate to enter." She glanced at me, then back at Tom. "Are you threatening to arrest members of a residential association?" Tom scratched his jaw. "No, ma'am. I'm explaining what happens when people refuse to stop committing a crime after a sheriff explains it slowly." That finally moved her. The tents came down. The canoes went back on the trailer. The security men avoided eye contact while Tom copied their names and discovered 3 of them were working without Wyoming licenses. Celeste was the last through the gate. She stopped on the public side and looked at me with all the warmth of January steel. "This is not over, Mr. Mercer." I looked at the broken chain between us. "No, Mrs. Harrow," I said. "It has barely started." By Tuesday morning, the Harrows had traded bolt cutters for a process server, which I suppose they considered an improvement in manners. Dad opened the front door, accepted a thick envelope, and carried it into the kitchen with 2 fingers like it smelled bad. The complaint was 47 pages long and asked the court to recognize a recreational easement across our creek frontage, award Ridgeview Preserve $3 million for loss of community enjoyment, and permanently prevent my family from interfering with association members who wish to hike, fish, picnic, canoe, photograph wildlife, or conduct what the complaint called wellness activities on our property. I read that phrase twice. Wellness activities. Apparently, trespassing became healthier when performed in expensive footwear. The complaint was signed by Preston Vale, and attached behind it were 3 county filings made during the previous 5 weeks. One claimed our barn, built in 1931, violated modern setback requirements. Another described my mother's wildflower strip as an unmanaged invasive weed corridor. The third accused Dad's old green tractor of creating repeated traffic hazards whenever he drove it down the county road to help my uncle during hay season. Claire came to the ranch before noon and read everything at the kitchen table while Dad repaired the west gate outside. She made small marks in the margins, occasionally shaking her head. When she finished, she closed the complaint and looked at me. "There is no easement deed, no court order, no documented historic use, and no legal theory in here that survives contact with daylight. We will move to dismiss, then counterclaim for trespass, property damage, malicious litigation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and exploitation of an elderly adult." Dad came through the back door carrying the broken chain. "Elderly adult," he said. "I can still lift the salt block by myself." Claire looked over her glasses. "Ever did. The law is trying to help you. Then the law should call me experienced." She smiled. "Experienced adult abuse does not sound nearly as serious." Dad set the chain on the counter. "I do not know. Sounds expensive." That was the last time any of us laughed for the next 2 days. On Thursday morning, Dad drove into Red Bluff for his regular coffee with 4 ranchers he'd known since Eisenhower was president. They met twice a week at a place called Millie's Cafe, where the coffee was strong, the pie was respectable, and the back table had been informally reserved for men who considered blood pressure medication a private matter. Dad usually came home around noon. That day, he returned at 12:40, walked through the kitchen without removing his hat, and sat in the den facing the dark television. I was on the phone with the governor's staff preparing Monday's public introduction, but the look on his face made me end the call. What happened? He kept staring at the television. Celeste came into Millie's with 3 women from her board. They sat beside us. They were loud. He swallowed once. She said the Mercers were selfish old ranch trash who had kept Red Bluff poor for 100 years. She said you were a small-town judge with a new government title, and that you would learn soon enough that state offices do not protect obsolete families. I sat across from him, feeling something cold and precise begin to form behind my ribs. Did she speak to you directly? Dad nodded. She came over, put her hand on Walter Grady's chair, and told us the smart thing would be to convince me to settle before the sheriff started arresting our children and grandchildren for interfering with community property. Millie told her to leave. Celeste laughed and asked whether Millie planned to keep serving coffee to men who were standing in the way of progress. Dad finally took off his hat. Walter has known me 70 years, he said quietly. You should not have had to sit there and hear that because of me. It was not because of you. He covered his face with both hands, and for a moment I saw not the man who would raise me, but an 83-year-old widower being humiliated in front of the few friends he had left from childhood. I had seen my father cry only twice before. Once when his mother died and once at Lydia's funeral, when he stood beside me after everyone else had gone home and admitted he had no idea what to say. I did not know what to say now either. So I sat with him until he lowered his hands. Then he wiped his eyes with a blue bandana and looked at me. Do not do anything angry, Miles. Do it right, the way Lydia would have wanted. I nodded. That promise mattered because the angry way was standing very close to me just then, offering several satisfying but temporary solutions. Instead, I went into my study and called Claire. She listened, asked for the names of every witness, then said the coffee shop incident strengthened the elder abuse and defamation claims. When she finished, I told her there was another call I wanted to make. To Cheyenne, I said. To Daniel Rourke in the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Unit. Claire went quiet. You think Ridgeview's corporate filings are dirty. I think people who invent easements usually invent other things too. Daniel Rourke had spent 18 years investigating fraudulent charities, sham development companies, and non-profit boards that treated member dues like family checking accounts. He listened to my summary without interrupting. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. Miles, we have 4 separate complaints involving Ridgeview Preserve, but none of the homeowners had enough documentation to support a full investigation. One family alleged false assessments. Another claimed the Harrows were charging maintenance fees on land that was never transferred to the association. A third said association records disappeared after she requested an audit. Your boundary dispute may connect all of it. Can you review every filing connected to the association and the Harrow Development Company? Already doing it, he said. Also, congratulations on the appointment. I was hoping your first week would be boring. So was I. Boring is underrated. By Friday evening, Daniel sent Claire and me a 52-page preliminary findings report, and the first paragraph explained why Celeste had been so confident in my gate. Ridgeview Preserve had not merely claimed our creekland during the lawsuit. The Harrows had included 280 acres of Mercer property inside the association's original corporate boundary description 6 years earlier. Their development maps labeled it Protected Community Open Space. Their sales brochures promised homeowners private access to 3 miles of creek frontage. Their annual budgets charged each household for conservation, security, trail maintenance, and liability coverage on land the association had never owned. Over 6 years, those assessments totaled just under $800,000. The boundary filing had been notarized by Nolan Harrow's former business partner, whose Wyoming notary commission had expired 11 months before the document was signed. Ridgeview's financial reports listed our acreage as a capital asset. The Harrow Development Company had used the same land as supporting collateral for a construction loan worth $2.4 million. Their tax filings claimed deductions for environmental improvements that had never occurred. The security company Celeste brought to our gate was owned by her younger brother and had no authority to operate in Wyoming. Preston Vale had written 3 opinion letters supporting the association's claim, although billing records showed he had never reviewed the Mercer deed or county survey. I read the report at the kitchen counter while Dad ate beef stew and watched me over his spoon. "Is it bad?" he asked. "For us, no. For them, extremely." "How extremely?" I turned the laptop toward him. Dad read the first 2 pages slowly, then leaned back. "They sold people land they did not own." "They sold people the idea of it," I said, "then charged them every year for the privilege of believing the lie." He looked toward the window, where the repaired gate stood dark against the evening sky. "His father tried to buy this ranch from your grandmother in 1982, he said. Nolan's father. He offered half of what it was worth, then told her the county could make life difficult for a widow. She told him to get off the porch. I'd never heard that story. Dad folded his napkin carefully. Nolan's grandfather tried something similar with my grandfather after the war. Different company, same family. They have been reaching across that fence for 3 generations. I want you to remember that before you decide what comes next. I closed the laptop. What came next was already sitting inside Wyoming law. As Secretary of State, I had authority to take administrative action against non-profit corporations formed through fraud, operating beyond their lawful purpose, or causing documented harm to members and the public. But because my family owned the land at the center of the scheme, I needed every finding independently established, reviewed, and supported by investigators who did not answer to me personally. I called Daniel again. "Build the complete record," I said. "Every corporate filing, every assessment, every false map, every bank statement, every homeowner complaint. I want an independent recommendation on whether Ridgeview Preserve Association should be administratively dissolved." He was silent for a moment. "And if the evidence supports dissolution, then prepare the order for Monday morning." "What number?" I looked at Dad through the kitchen doorway. He was standing at the sink washing his own bowl, because grief had never once convinced him dishes could wait. "Order number 1, I said. Daniel understood. Before we hung up, he added one more thing. "Miles, you should know the Harrows scheduled a special association meeting for Sunday. They plan to impose a $9,000 assessment on every household to finance the lawsuit and expanded security. 58 homes, $522,000. They are making their residents pay to defend the fraud committed against them. That is what people do when they know the floor is collapsing," I said. "They start selling tickets to the ceiling." Saturday afternoon, Nolan Harrow drove through our repaired gate in a black Range Rover and stopped near the porch. Dad was outside alone, drinking coffee in his rocking chair. Nolan climbed the steps carrying a cream envelope and spoke with the soft, patient voice of a man trying to purchase obedience without calling it that. He offered Dad $75,000 for what he described as the family's disputed creek interest, promised to end the lawsuit, and said the matter could remain private. Dad read the check, tore it cleanly into 4 pieces, and let them fall between Nolan's polished shoes. "Your grandfather tried to scare my grandfather," he said. "Your father tried to cheat my mother. Now you are standing on my porch trying to buy what your wife could not steal with bolt cutters." Nolan's face changed. It was only a flicker, but Dad saw it. "I am offering you a dignified exit. Everder." Dad picked up his coffee. "The dignified exit is behind you." Nolan stood there another few seconds, then walked back to his vehicle. Dad called me immediately afterward and repeated the conversation almost word for word. I forwarded his statement and the porch camera footage to Daniel. Sunday evening, while the Harrows pushed their $500,000 assessment through a divided association board, I drove to Cheyenne with 3 suits, 1 box of case files, and a speech about modernizing business registration that I no longer intended to give. I sat at the small kitchen table in the state apartment until after midnight, rewriting every page. At 6:30 Monday morning, Daniel entered my office carrying 2 leather portfolios, one held the completed independent findings and a recommendation to dissolve Ridgeview Preserve Association. The other held criminal referrals for corporate fraud, wire fraud, tax fraud, false notarization, unlicensed security operations, elder exploitation, and intentional interference with property rights. I read both files line by line. Then I picked up the old silver pen from the desk drawer, turned to the signature page of the first order, and signed my name. Daniel gathered the portfolios. "When should service occur?" he asked. I checked the schedule for the Western Land Development Conference taking place 4 blocks away, where Nolan and Celeste were listed as featured speakers. 9:42, I said, not a minute earlier. By then, they will know exactly who signed it. At 9 o'clock, I walked into the press room on the second floor of the Capitol, where 40 reporters, 11 television cameras, the governor, Claire, and my father were waiting. Dad sat in the third row wearing his only dark suit, a bolo tie my mother had bought him in Jackson 30 years earlier, and the expression of a man who would rather be repairing fence. I stepped behind the podium, adjusted the microphone, and introduced myself as Wyoming's newly appointed Secretary of State. Then I introduced my father. I told the room he was 83, that he had spent his life caring for land his grandfather bought in 1927, and that he had taught me a simple Wyoming principle. People do not get to run their neighbors off their own property simply because they have more money, better lawyers, or a prettier brochure. The room went still. I explained that the Secretary of State's office was responsible for maintaining the integrity of corporations and nonprofit organizations registered in Wyoming, including homeowners associations, and that when an organization was created through fraud, falsified public records, operated outside its lawful authority, or caused a pattern of consumer harm, the state had both the power and the duty to act. Then I placed the leather portfolio on the podium. Effective upon service, I said. Order number 1 administratively dissolves Ridgeview Preserve Association Incorporated. The order rests on independently verified findings that the association fraudulently included 280 acres of Mercer Ranch property within its corporate boundaries, collected nearly $800,000 in assessments connected to land it did not own, used an expired notary commission to authenticate false documents, misrepresented private property as community open space, and financed legal and security operations intended to intimidate an elderly landowner. I could hear camera shutters firing. The association's authority to collect dues, impose assessments, file claims, or act on behalf of residents was suspended immediately. A court-appointed receiver would manage the transition into a new resident-controlled organization, review 6 years of finances, and return improperly collected funds wherever possible. Then I opened the second portfolio. My office and the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Unit had also prepared criminal referrals involving Nolan and Celeste Harrow, their development company, their unlicensed security contractor, their former notary, and their attorney, Preston Vale. The referrals included suspected corporate fraud, wire fraud, tax fraud, false notarization, unlicensed contracting, elder exploitation, and intentional interference with property rights. I closed the folder and looked toward Dad. The homeowners of Ridgeview Preserve are not the enemy here, I said. Many of them purchased homes based on false information. Their homes remain theirs. Their neighborhood remains, and they deserve an association that serves them instead of using them as a checking account. My father will return home today and drink coffee on the porch of the same ranch his family has protected for nearly a century. The state of Wyoming intends to make sure he can do so without strangers cutting his gate. Hands went up across the room. A reporter from Casper asked about my personal conflict of interest. I acknowledged it directly and explained that the investigation, findings, and dissolution recommendation had been prepared independently by Daniel Rourke's unit, supported by documents and homeowner complaints that existed before I entered office. A reporter from Red Bluff asked whether Dad would comment. I looked at him, he sighed, stood slowly, and faced the room. Mr. Mercer, the reporter asked, what does today mean to you? Dad held the edge of the chair in front of him and thought for a while. It means my grandmother was right to tell Nolan Harrow's father to get off her porch, he said. It means my grandfather was right to keep the deed in a tin box during the Depression. Mostly, it means a locked gate still means no. Even when the person on the other side owns a Range Rover. The room laughed, then quieted again. Dad touched the bolo tie at his collar. 3 generations of Harrows tried to reach across that fence. My son did not beat them because he got angry. He beat them because he read what they signed. Then he sat down. I checked my watch. It was 9:41. 4 blocks away, Nolan and Celeste were seated at a front table inside the Western Land Development Conference, watching the broadcast on 2 large screens. Witnesses later said Celeste had been smiling when I entered the press room. At 9:12, when I named Ridgeview Preserve, she stopped. At 9:19, when I announced the criminal referrals, Nolan leaned toward her and whispered something that made her turn pale. At exactly 9:42, Daniel Rohr entered the conference hall with 2 state investigators and a process server. He crossed the room, placed the dissolution order in front of Nolan, then laid the criminal referral notice beside Celeste's coffee cup. A local photographer captured the moment. Celeste's hand was frozen above the table. Nolan was staring at my signature, and behind them a conference banner read, "Building Trust Across the American West." That photograph ran statewide the next morning. 6 months later, Nolan accepted a plea agreement that included 5 years in federal custody, full financial disclosure, and a permanent ban from real estate development in Wyoming. Celeste received 3 years, probation afterward, and a lifetime prohibition from serving on any nonprofit board or homeowners association in the state. Ridgeview residents recovered more than $600,000 through restitution and civil settlement. Their new cooperative cut annual dues by almost half and removed every reference to Mercer land from its maps. Preston Vale lost his license for 2 years. Celeste's brother's security company was shut down permanently. Dad received compensation for property damage, harassment, and elder exploitation, though he complained that Claire used too many zeros and refused to buy anything more exciting than a new hydraulic post driver. My daughter Hannah graduated from veterinary school that fall and returned to Red Bluff to reopen the clinic her mother had once dreamed of building. We also placed 1,500 acres of the ranch into a permanent conservation easement, which means no developer, no corporation, and no ambitious future relative can divide it into luxury parcels. Dad signed the deed of the creek with Hannah and me beside him. Afterward, he looked toward the old survey marker and said, "Well, now they will have to steal something else." I am still Secretary of State, and the corporate review that began with Ridgeview has uncovered 4 other associations using false boundaries and hidden assessments. Some people say I went too far because the Harrows made the mistake of targeting the family of a public official. Others say they finally met someone with enough authority to stop them. I still think about that question. Was it justice? Or did power simply land in the right hands for once? Tell me what you think. If an HOA cut your gate, humiliated your father, and tried to claim your family land, would you settle quietly, fight them in court, or use every lawful tool available to bring the whole operation down? Share your answer in the comments. Send this story to someone who believes a deed still means something. And subscribe for the next story, because sometimes the most dangerous person at the fence is not the one holding the bolt cutter. It is the quiet man who already knows what every signature on the page is worth.